900 kilograms, could be carried upon underwing pylons. Operators often developed and installed their own munitions, such as Rhodesia's anti-personnel bomblets, the Alpha bomb. A varied range of munitions was employed on Canberra fleets around the world. Anti-personnel flushed bombs were tested successfully from the Canberra by Rhodesia, but not used operationally due to international agreements. In part due to its range limitation of just 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers, and its inability to carry the early, bulky nuclear bombs, the Canberra was typically employed in the role of a tactical bomber as opposed to that of a strategic one. In British service, many of the Canberras that were stationed overseas were not modified to deliver nuclear weapons until as late as 1957. Operational History, edit. Royal Air Force, edit. The Canberra B.2 started to enter service with 101 Squadron in January 1951, with 101 Squadron being fully equipped by May, and a further squadron, number 9 Squadron, equipping by the end of the year. The production of the Canberra was accelerated as a result of the outbreak of the Korean War. Orders for the aircraft increased and outpaced production capacity, as the aircraft was designated as a super priority. A further 5 squadrons were able to be equipped with the Canberra by the end of 1952, however. Production in the 1951-52 period had only been half of the level planned, due to shortages in skilled manpower, material, and suitable machine tools. The Canberra replaced Mosquitoes, Lincolns, and Washingtons as frontline bombers, showing a drastically improved performance, and proving to be effectively immune from interception during air defense exercises until the arrival of the Hawker Hunter. The Canberra also replaced the RAF's Mosquitoes in the reconnaissance role, with the Canberra PR.3 entering service in December 1952. The improved Canberra B.6, with more powerful engines and a greater fuel capacity, started to supplement the B.2s in the UK-based squadrons of Bomber Command from June 1954, when they replaced 101 squadrons B.2s. This freed up older B.2s to allow Canberra squadrons to form overseas, with bomber and reconnaissance Canberra wings forming in RAF Germany and on Cyprus, with squadrons also being deployed to the Far East. Canberra PR.3 of number 540 Squadron RAF at London Heathrow in June 1953. The PR.7 variant of the Canberra, fitted with Avon 109 engines, executed a 1953 reconnaissance flight over the Soviet rocket launch and development site at Cape Estinja, although the UK government has never admitted the existence of such a flight. Warned by either radar or agents inside the British government, the Soviets slightly damaged one aircraft. Further reconnaissance flights are alleged to have taken place along, and over, the borders of the Soviet Union in 1954 under the code name Project Robin, using the Canberra B.2 WH-726. The USAF also used the Canberra for reconnaissance flights. The aircraft were no longer required after June 1956, following the introduction of the US Lockheed U-2 purpose-built reconnaissance aircraft. Project Robin was then terminated. These RAF Canberra overflights were later featured in the 1994 BBC Time Watch episode, Spies in the Sky, and included interviews with some of the Soviet MiG-15 pilots who had attempted to intercept them. The Canberra was the victorious aircraft flown in the last Great Air Race from London to Christchurch in 1953, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Roland Monty Burton, which touched down at Christchurch 41 minutes ahead of its closest rival, after 23 hours and 51 minutes in the air. To this day, the record has never been broken. The Vickers Valiant entered service in 1955. capable of carrying much heavier weapon loads, including the Blue Danube nuclear weapon, over longer ranges than the Canberra. This led to the Bomber Command Force of Canberra's equipped for high-level conventional bombing to be gradually phased out. This did not mean the end of the Canberra in frontline service, as it proved suitable for the low-level strike and ground attack role, and versions dedicated to this role were brought into service. The interim B.I.6 converted from the B.6 by adding provision for a pack of 4 Hispano 20mm cannon in the rear bomb bay and underwing pylons for bombs and rockets, entered service in 1955, with the definitive, new-build B.I.8, which added a new forward fuselage with a fighter-style canopy for the pilot, entering service in January 1956. During the Cold War, the Canberra B-6 was used by RAF 76 Squadron to sample atomic and thermonuclear mushroom clouds during the British nuclear tests in Australia and on Christmas Island. The Canberra B-6 were fitted with specialized equipment to collect particulate samples from the mushroom clouds at various heights. It was quite risky as the equipment measuring radiation when they were in the cloud was not always accurate. An important role for the new low-level force was tactical nuclear strike, using the low-altitude bombing system to allow a nuclear bomb to be delivered from low level while allowing the bomber to escape the blast of the weapon. RAF Germany's force of 4 squadrons equipped with the B.I.6 and B.I.8 could carry US-owned Mark 7 nuclear bombs from 1960, which were replaced by B-43 nuclear bombs, also US-owned, from 1965. 3 squadrons based on Cyprus and 1 at Singapore were armed with British-owned Redbeard nuclear weapons. Bomber Command retired the last of its Canberras on the 11th of September, 1961, but the Germany, Cyprus and Singapore-based squadrons continued in the nuclear strike role. The Cyprus-based squadrons and one of the RAF Germany squadrons disbanded in 1969, with the Singapore-based unit followed in 1970. The 3 remaining RAF Germany units, which by now had replaced the old Mark 7 bombs with newer, but still US-owned, B-43 nuclear bombs, remained operational until 1972, the last Canberra bombers in RAF service. Group of RAF Canberra B.15s of No. 45 Squadron at RAF Tengah, Singapore, 1963. The RAF continued to operate the Canberra after 1972, employing it for reconnaissance, with squadrons equipped with PR.7s and PR.9s being based at RAF Whitton in the UK and RAF Lucca in Malta. The PR.9s were fitted with special long-range optical photography cameras, reportedly based on those used by the Lockheed U-2, to allow high-altitude photography of targets deep inside Eastern Europe while flying along the inner German border, as well as infrared line-scan cameras for low-level night reconnaissance. The RAF used Canberras to search for hidden arms dumps using false-color photography during Operation Motorman in July 1972, when the British Army retook Irish Republican-held no-go areas in Belfast and Derry. Canberras were used for reconnaissance during the Bosnian War during the 1990s, where they were used to locate mass graves, and during the Kosovo War in 1999. They were also operated from Uganda during the First Congo War, where they were used to search for refugees. Small numbers of specially equipped Canberras were also used for signals intelligence, being operated by 192 Squadron and then 51 Squadron from 1953 to 1976. During the Falklands War, a plan to supply 2 PR.9s to the Chilean Air Force, and secretly operate them with RAF crews over the war zone, was abandoned for political reasons. The aircraft got as far as Belize before the operation was cancelled. The PR.9 variant remained in service with No. 39, 1 PRU Squadron until July 2006 for strategic reconnaissance and photographic mapping, seeing service in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and up to June 2006 in Afghanistan. During a ceremony to mark the standing down of 39 1 PRU Squadron at RAF Marham on the 28th of July 2006, a fly past by a Canberra PR.9 on its last ever sortie was conducted. Royal Australian Air Force, edit. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, the Australian government initiated a wide-scale reorganisation of the armed forces. As part of this process, the Royal Australian Air Force, RAF, developed Plan D as the basis for its post-war structure. Plan D was built around the concept of a numerically smaller, but more agile air arm that would employ leading-edge technology. During the late 1940s, the RAF decided to acquire the Canberra as a replacement for, or complement to, the Avro Lincoln, though fears were raised that the new design was not especially advanced. While Australia never introduced nuclear weapons into service, the Canberra's ability to carry such a payload was a stated factor in its acquisition. Australia's planned force of 48 Canberras, which held the potential for being nuclear-armed, was viewed as far more potent and deterring to potential opponents than the RAF's entire wartime forces of 254 heavy bombers. And RAF Canberra during maintenance, circa 1967. The Australian government decided that the RAF's Canberras would be constructed domestically by the government aircraft factories as opposed to being manufactured in the UK. On the 29th of May 1953, the first Australian-built Canberra performed its first flight at Avalon Airport, Victoria. This aircraft was delivered to the RAF for service trials a few weeks later. In December 1953, the Canberra formally entered Australian service. From July 1950 to July 1960, during the Malayan emergency, Canberras from Australia, New Zealand, and the UK were deployed into Malaysia to fight against communist guerrillas. In 1967, the RAF deployed 8 Canberras to the Vietnam War. The unit, No. 2 Squadron, was later commended for its performance by the United States Air Force. The Canberras were typically operated in the low-level bombing role, taking responsibility for South Vietnam's southernmost military regions, Regions 3 and 4, and allowing USAF bombers to deploy their aircraft to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While USAF Canberras were equipped with .50 caliber machine guns or 20mm cannon for strafing, Australian Canberras were deployed to South Vietnam without guns, hence were deployed strictly for low-level bombing missions. Upon their redeployment from Vietnam in 1971, No. 2 Squadron had flown about 12,000 sorties and dropped 76,389 bombs, and lost 2 of their aircraft to missiles and ground fire during the course of the war. As early as 1954, Australia recognised that the Canberra was becoming outdated, and evaluated aircraft such as the Avro Vulcan and Handler Page Victor as potential replacements. The Canberra was incapable of providing adequate coverage of Indonesia from Australian bases, and was evaluated as having a very low chance of survival if it encountered modern fighters like the MiG-17. Political pressure for a Canberra replacement rose to a head in 1962. Australia evaluated the BAC TSR-2, Dassault Mirage 4, McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, and North American A-5 Vigilante, and initially appeared to favour the TSR-2, but chose to procure the General Dynamics F-111C in October 1963. Due in part to delays in the delivery of the F-111CS, the Canberra continued to be used by Australia for a total of 29 years before its retirement in June 1982. Indian Air Force, edit. The Canberra was the backbone of the Indian Air Force, IAF, for bombing raids and photo reconnaissance for many decades. Negotiations to acquire the Canberra as a replacement for the obsolete consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers then being used by IAF began in 1954. During the extended negotiations between Britain and India, the Soviet Union is alleged to have offered their own jet bomber, the Ilyushin Il-28, at a significantly lower price than that asked for the Canberra. By April 1956, however, the Indian government was in favor of the purchase. In January 1957, India placed a large order for the Canberra, in total, 54 B.I.58 bombers, 8 PR.57 photo reconnaissance aircraft, and 6 T.4 training aircraft were ordered, and deliveries began in the summer of that same year. 12 more Canberras were ordered in September 1957, and as many as 30 more may have also been purchased by 1962. On the 10th of April 1959, an Indian Canberra was shot down while performing a reconnaissance mission over Rawalpindi. The Canberra was shot down by a F-86F Sabre flown by Flight Lieutenant M. Yunus. The two crew members of the Canberra ejected and were later arrested by Pakistani authorities. This incident also marked the first aerial victory of the Pakistan Air Force. First used in combat by the IAF in 1962, the Canberra was employed during the UN campaign against the breakaway Republic of Katanga in Africa. During the Indo-Pakistani Wars of the 1960s and 1970s, the Canberra was used by both sides. The most audacious use of the bomber was in the raid on Badin during the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, when the IAF sent in the Canberra to attack a critical Pakistani radar post in West Pakistan. The raid was a complete success, the radars in Badin having been badly damaged by the bombing and put out of commission. A later raid by the IAF was attempted on Peshawar Air Base with the aim of destroying, amongst other targets, several Pakistani B-57 bombers, American-built Canberras. Due to poor visibility, a road outside of the base was bombed, instead of the runway where PAF B-57 bombers were parked. During the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, Indian Canberras flew a strategically important sortie against the Karak oil tanks, which had the effect of helping the Indian Navy in their own operations, a series of missile boat attacks against the Pakistani coast. On the 21st of May 1999, prior to the commencement of the Kargil War, the IAF Air HQ assigned a Canberra PR.57 aircraft on a photographic mission near the line of control, where it took a severe blow from a FIM-92 Stinger infrared homing missile on the starboard engine. The Canberra successfully returned to base using the other engine. The entire IAF Canberra fleet was grounded and then retired following the crash of an IAF Canberra in December 2005. After 50 years of service, the Canberra was finally retired by the IAF on the 11th of May 2007. Middle East and Africa, edit. SAF Canberra B.12 with inertial navigation and special sensors package over Transvaal. During the Suez Crisis, the IAF employed around 100 Canberras, flying conventional bombing and reconnaissance missions from airfields in Malta and Cyprus. A total of 278 Canberra sorties were flown, dropping 1,439 1,000-pound, 450 kilograms, bombs. However, low-level strikes by smaller fighters were judged to be more effective than the nighttime bombing operations performed by both the Canberra and the Vickers Valiant. In addition, many of the bombs, intended to hit Egyptian airfields, missed their targets, failing to inflict much damage to the Egyptian Air Force or to badly demoralize the enemy. While interception of the Canberra was within the capabilities of Egypt's MiG-15S and MiG-17S, as shown by the interception of Canberras by MiG-15s prior to the Anglo-French invasion. These did not result in any losses. The only Canberra shot down during the Suez campaign was a PR.7 shot down by a Syrian Gloucester Meteor fighter on the 6th of November, 1956, the last day of the war. The Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland considered the Canberra an important objective to holding greater diplomatic sway in the African continent, and ongoing negotiations over the Baghdad Treaty, and a step towards decolonization. The Suez Crisis caused a delay in the sale, but in August 1957 18 Canberras had been earmarked to be refurbished and transferred from the RAF to the Royal Rhodesian Air Force, RAF. Both Rhodesia and South Africa used Canberras in their respective bush wars. Numerous aircraft were lost in the conflict, only one of which was lost by the South African Air Force. Rhodesian B.2 Canberras together with South African B.12 Canberras carried out attacks on insurgents in Mozambique, usually armed with Alpha cluster bombs, several raids on Zambia, and attacks upon multiple insurgent bases in Angola. Ethiopian Canberras were used against Eritrea and again against Somalia during the 1970s. Sweden, edit. The Swedish Air Force purchased 2 Canberras from the RAF in 1960, and had these modified to T.11s by Boulton Paul. The aircraft were secretly modified in Sweden as espionage aircraft for eavesdropping on primarily Soviet, Polish, and East German military radio transmissions, although this was not publicly admitted until 10 years later. The Canberras were given the designation TP-52, and taken into service as testing aircraft, until they were replaced by 2 TP-85 Caravels in 1971. South America, edit. Venezuela, edit. On the 20th of April, 1960, the Venezuelan Air Force used its Canberra B.2 and B.8s to bomb the airport at San Cristobal, Táchira, which had been seized by rebels, led by General José María Castro León. The rebels surrendered shortly afterward. On the 26th of June, 1961, Venezuela's Canberras were used against rebelling army forces in Barcelona, Venezuela. Peru, edit. Peruvian Air Force Canberras flew combat sorties against Ecuadorian positions during the Cenipal War in 1995. On the 6th of February, 1995, a Canberra B.68 disappeared over the operations zone. The aircraft had apparently struck a hill in poor weather conditions. Peru retired its Canberras in June 2005 and the survivors put in reserve until 2008. Peru bought 9 B.78X, B.8 in 1956, 6 B.72X, B.2 in 1966, 3 T.74X, T.4 in 1966, 6 B.56X, B.6, 12 B.68X, B.8 in 1974. They also bought 5X SAF B.12X, B.8 and 1 T.74X, T.4. Argentina, edit. The Argentine Air Force received 10 B.62 bombers and 2 T.64 trainers at the beginning of the 1970s, replacing the Avro Lincoln in the bomber role. Argentina retired its last Canberras in April 2000. During the Falklands War in 1982, 8 of them were deployed to Trelew, 670 mi, 1,080 kilometers, from the islands, to avoid congestion on the closer southern airfields. Although within operating range of the British task force, the Canberra was judged to be a limited threat due to its poor maneuverability compared with the British Sea Harriers. From the 1st of May to the 14th of June, 1982, Argentine Canberras made 54 sorties. 36 of them were bombing missions, of which 22 were at night against ground troops. 2 aircraft were lost in combat. The first to a Sea Harrier's AIM-9L Sidewinder air-to-air missile on the 1st of May, 1982. On the 13th of June, 1982, a second Canberra B.62 of Grupo de Bombardeo 2, B-108 was shot down at 39,000 feet, 12,000 m, when it was struck by a Sea Dart missile fired from HMS Cardiff. The pilot ejected safely, but the navigator was killed. It was the last Argentine aircraft to be lost in combat during the Falklands War, with Argentine forces surrendering the next day. Royal New Zealand Air Force, edit. The Royal New Zealand Air Force, ANZAF, leased 17 Canberra B.2s and 3 T.4s from the RAF from 1958 to 1962 pending delivery of their own Canberras. The leased Canberras were operated by No. 75 Squadron ANZAF out of RAF Tengah, Singapore, and were used in operations during the Malayan emergency. 1 aircraft was destroyed during this period. The ANZAF took delivery of 11 B.12s and 2 T.13 trainers between 1959 and 1961, and these were operated by No. 14 Squadron ANZAF. In 1964, No. 14 Squadron was deployed to RAF Tengah and participated in the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation before returning to New Zealand in November 1966. 3 of the B.12s were destroyed in accidents. The Canberra was replaced by the A4K Skyhawk in 1970, and the 8 surviving B.12s and the 2 T.13s were sold to India. Development and Trials Aircraft, edit. A number of Canberras were used by English Electric for development work and trials on new equipment. It was also used by government establishments such as the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the Royal Radar Establishment. The Canberra proved to be a useful platform for such work and was used by a number of British tests and trials establishments. A number of engine manufacturers were also lent Canberras as engine test beds, Armstrong Siddeley for the Sapphire, Bristol Siddeley for the Olympus, de Havilland Engine Company for the Gyron Junior Turbojet, and Rolls-Royce Limited for the Avon. Ferranti used 4 different Canberra B.2s for avionics development work. One example is WV787, built as a Canberra B.2 in 1952. It was lent to Armstrong Siddeley and fitted with Sapphire engines. It was later transferred to Ferranti for trials for the Blackburn Buccaneers Blue Parrot radar and fitted with a B.8 type nose and a Buccaneer-style radome. It next was moved to the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment where it was modified to be used as a water spray tanker aircraft for de-icing trials. It would fly in front of the aircraft being tested, which would fly into the artificial cloud created by the sprayed water to induce icing. It was retired in 1984 and later preserved at the Newark Air Museum and is a national benchmark airframe on the National Aviation Heritage Register. Flight records set by Canberras, edit. The 21st of January, 1951 first non-stop unrefueled transatlantic crossing by a jet. The 26th of August, 1952 the prototype B.5 made the first double transatlantic crossing by a jet, with a total time of 10 hours, 3 minutes. The 4th of May, 1953 Canberra B.2 WD952, fitted with Rolls-Royce Olympus engines set a world altitude record, flying at 63,668 feet. 19,406 m. The 9th of October, 1953 winner of the 1953 London Christchurch Air Race, It covered 12,270 miles, 19,750 kilometers, in 23 hours, 51 minutes. Its average speed was 515 miles per hour, 829 kilometers per hour. As of 2018, this record still stands. The 29th of August, 1955 altitude record, 65,889 feet, 20,083 m. The 28th of August, 1957 altitude record, 70,000